Whenever the topic of Fire Emblem remakes comes up, there's a point that's often made against remaking Genealogy of the Holy War. Namely, that the game's really messed up in ways that would be complicated to censor. Never mind how the main plot includes a brother and sister making babies together, or the rocks fall, everyone dies ending to the first generation. This is the game that lets you arrange your very own teen pregnancies. I love you, Yggdrasil, but you are hard to talk about sometimes. On the other hand, hypothetical remakes of the Tellius games rarely generate this type of response. Superficially speaking, there's no need for it, especially in light of just how many Fire Emblem players know about the general substance of these games indirectly, but haven't actually played them on account of how inaccessible they can be. In the decade and a half or so since their release, Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn have developed something of a reputation for being a progressive watershed in a franchise notorious for being uneven on that score. Tellius is a story of overcoming racism on both personal and systemic levels, backed by more respectfully designed and written female characters than you're liable to find in any of the Kaga games or most of the modern games from Awakening onward. They also star Fire Emblem's sole commoner lord to date, or at least the only one who's not a stillborn zombie powered by the heart of the goddess camped out in their head. What can I say, Byleth is weird. And Ike breaks further boundaries with his paired endings, which have seen him grown to become the series' most high-profile, potentially queer character of the pre-Avatar era. All those qualifiers aside, that's saying a lot for a pair of games that came out in the mid-2000s. However, that reputation isn't entirely representative of what's actually in the Tellius games once you get into them. As someone who played the duology when they were current, and who then watched fandom gradually develop its own interpretations of Tellius over the years, I find the disconnect between how this setting is often perceived and what it actually is to be rather fascinating. It's not my intention to be negative here. The Tellius games are among my favorite Fire Emblem titles, and before we get into the more complicated bits of their legacy, I am going to go over those elements that they genuinely handle well, and deserve to be praised for. But if you're coming into the Tellius games fresh, or if you haven't played these games in years and only recall their broad strokes, I wanted to make an effort to provide a more rounded picture of what they have to offer in terms of progressive writing. That way, in the unlikely event that Nintendo and IS announce remakes, or even just put these games up on a virtual console service one of these days, you'll have an easier time managing your expectations. In light of how inconsistently IS has handled previous Fire Emblem remakes, that's about as much as can be hoped for. Let's give credit where credit is due. If there's anything Tellius' writing excels at, to a degree not seen in any Fire Emblem setting before or since, that would be its treatment of its female characters. The threats of gendered violence common in the Kaga era and even in the GBA games are largely absent here. And unlike in any of those older titles, women in Tellius are allowed to hold ruling positions, and not merely serve as support for their brothers, husbands, or that prince from the kingdom next door. While one could certainly quibble over the handling of individual cases, and Radiant Dawn does eventually return the male saga hero to the starring role partly at the expense of the rest of the cast, Tellius' women are leaps and bounds ahead of their counterparts in older titles. They're allowed to be complex, to make mistakes and learn from them, and to take center stage in their own narrative arcs. Path of Radiance even graces us with the incredibly rare female villain who isn't brainwashed, in love with her evil boss, or in need of a self-insert to save her, and Patrine gets to be genuinely threatening and despicable on her own terms. Imagine that. Even looking backwards on the Tellius games in comparison to the modern series, their character design is on the whole remarkably understated, considering that this also happens to be the setting with catgirls in it. Naturally, there are still standouts in this cast that Heroes has taken full advantage of, but even they're nothing to the mountains of deliberate fan service that have characterized the designs in this series from Awakening onward. In fact, many of the horniest designs in Tellius belong to men. making these games arguably the only ones in the franchise to even sort of approach fan service in an egalitarian way. The beefy likes of Tabarn, Knigas, and of course Ike have even inspired their fair share of spicy fan work by artists who never so much as picked up a Fire Emblem game, but who nonetheless have been inspired by these characters' appeal to a certain niche community. I'm talking about furries. That leads into Tellius' handling of queer content, which extends far beyond the unending debates over Ike's sexuality. Heather is the series' first definitively gay character ever, and remains one of the only exclusively same-sex attracted characters in Fire Emblem. Consider that something you'll never see in any game with Avatar S ranks. Even beyond Heather, the world of Tellius is a distinctly less heteronormative one than pretty much any other setting. There's the usual complement of gay subtext from all the expected sources: bickering Christmas cavaliers, a queen and her loyal knight, the support of gay wrongs in the form of a murderous knight who's pledged his loyalty to the main antagonist, not to mention everything Ike's got going on. But more than that is how Tellius allows queer-coded character dynamics to exist virtually without comment. Take, for example, Sigrun and Tanith acting as co-parents to their young empress, or Knigas' so-called shadow Gifka, and how the Lion King's heir is pointedly a nephew rather than a son, or Tabarn's role as Raisin's protector along with their lightly coupley dynamics. There's nothing saying outright that any of these characters are gay, but there's also nothing saying that they aren't. Queer readings thrive in those silent spaces, oddly helped out by Radiant Dawn's lack of a proper support system and minimal number of paired endings. Even the transition between the two games plays a role in that impression. Path of Radiance teases many of the predictable straight romantic setups via its standard support system, only to have its sequel come along and ignore many of those relationships in favor of lightly suggesting queer alternatives. True, some of that comes from just how little space Radiant Dawn has to develop most of its enormous cast, but it's still something. And for my part, of all the Fire Emblem settings, Tellius reads to me the most like one where queer people and their relationships can exist as an organic part of the world, even one commented upon by outside observers, and not a privilege exclusive to the player self-inserts, or else something reserved for relationships among isolated sets of characters that just so happen to receive the right kind of world-building support to make those readings work. It's understated, but also really affirming, especially for games that came out when they did. With all that pointed out, however, Radiant Dawn may have pared the recurring Bara Bandit archetypes down to even smaller bit roles that don't even have time to be awkward gay stereotypes, but it doesn't entirely move away from using that type of characterization. Note Valtome, a foppish minor villain inexplicably obsessed with Zelgius. Note even more Oliver, whose love of heron molestation knows no gender, and which Radiant Dawn mines for comedy for the sake of making him a playable joke character. Beauty as a Mad Mistress might be one of the most weirdly awesome battle themes in the series, but that's still all kinds of repulsive. We'll be getting into the messy racial dynamics of these games a bit later, but for now, suffice it to say that I find it difficult to enjoy Oliver even as a form of camp. That's not even touching on the expected assortment of dodgy relationship dynamics found in every Fire Emblem, from Leanne marrying her former babysitter to Micaiah marrying her own surrogate son. That's all old hat if you played enough of these games, but it's there all the same. And they're just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the flippancy with which Tellius handles what look like they're intended to be major themes, which is something that I believe is going to catch new players off guard should these games ever get remakes. If you played Echoes, remember how a bunch of people were annoyed that Alm is revealed to have been secretly royalty all along, and how that undermines the class-conscious rhetoric from earlier in the game? That twist isn't remotely surprising if you played even a handful of these games. But nonetheless, the frustration with IS teasing at subjects like social and economic inequality but never following through on them in any meaningful way is something that's been slowly building within parts of the fandom for a number of years now. Not helped, I'm sure, by a certain other modern title overpromising on that front as well. Ike may not be royalty incognito, but if all you know about the guy going in is that he's a commoner who slays a god, and who may or may not also be gay, you're likely to be disappointed with how little political involvement Ike actually has. Path of Radiance makes his primary role that of helping a princess take back her country and restore her throne, because she's paying his wages and because it's positioned as just the right thing to do. He actively resists leadership positions on multiple occasions, only taking them on when circumstances force him to, and he leaves it all behind in Radiant Dawn's postgame rather than play any role in the continent he just helped to save. The only alternative system of governance these games ever really propose is the Lagus, or some of them anyway, choosing their rulers based on strength, a mentality that the main villain of Path of Radiance takes to its survival of the fittest, meritocracy by murder extreme. Ike's praise for Lagu's leadership, as such, reads as a naive dislike of complicated political realities, and his frequent criticisms of nobility come off more as immature chafing at unfamiliar social rules than as efforts to address and dismantle systemic issues, with the exceptions of slavery and reparation for genocide. And even on those topics, Ike ends up following the lead of a sympathetic autocrat. Needless to say, establishing that slavery and genocide are bad is a very low bar to clear if you're looking for political commentary. But looking back at Oliver, does IS even truly manage that much? That's why so much of this comes down to keeping one's expectations low, because Fire Emblem has a long history of introducing superficially serious themes into its political war dramas, and then squandering them on tasteless jokes, or brushing them off as set dressing whenever they're no longer plot relevant, or refusing to take a stance on a multi-sided conflict because it might damage a character's popularity. Let's take a look at the Lagus as another example. Tellius was not the first time that Fire Emblem used shape-shifting demi-humans as stand-ins for racial others, nor would it be the last, but it is the setting where that element receives the most attention by far, and yet, how significant are the Lagus to these games truly? Here's a fun exercise for you. Go back and count up the chapters in both Tellius games that are set in Lagus nations. If we're being exceptionally generous, there's around half a dozen, in a duology with around 70 total chapters to its name. The Lagus may occupy around half the continent, but you'd never have guessed that from just how little direct action their countries see in these wars. Tell me honestly if you remember that a large number of the Hawk Lagus are massacred in an unexpected attack by Benyon during Part 3 of Radiant Dawn. I wouldn't blame you if you forgot that bit, because it happens completely off-screen and is ultimately only used as part of the setup for the reveal of how blood pacts work. But it's the biggest example I can think of how out of focus the Lagus are in these stories, even as we're meant to believe that they're a driving force in the plot. How about Lagus characters instead? Go online and look up just how many of them are in the playable rosters. In Radiant Dawn, there are 24 out of the 73 total, so just under 1/3. But let me go ahead and make something clear, since I apparently wasn't with my Dark Magic video. Gameplay mechanics are not all that relevant to the point I'm making here. Anyone who's played these games knows that the Lagus transformation gauge can be an immense pain to manage, such that those that stand out the best are either Herons, who have dancer utility, or otherwise royals who can shift back and forth at will for plot reasons. That doesn't need to be pointed out, nor is it any less obvious that the Beork make up the majority of the game's rosters because they fill all the familiar classes and roles that appear in every Fire Emblem. If you really must bring up gameplay performance, maybe consider that IS puts so little effort into developing such an essential mechanic as the transformation gauge that the best way for players to deal with it is to employ items, skills, and units that can bypass it entirely. When you get down to it, the Laguz really aren't handled all that differently from the Manakete of earlier titles, or the assorted shapeshifters of the 3DS games. These characters are far fewer in number, and their games hold no illusions about their relative significance to their stories. They're either bit players with an extremely localized presence in the setting, or else they represent an existential conflict above and beyond the scope of the mundane political maneuverings that make up the bulk of the narrative. Held up alongside these other examples, it's easier to understand what the Fire Emblem developers are primarily interested in here. They just want the cool novelty factor of spicing up their mostly human cast with a handful of playable shapeshifters, and they aren't terribly concerned that these same characters, chronically underdeveloped and confined to the edges of their own stories, could easily be read as racial minorities. Need more evidence, though? I haven't even gotten to the centerpiece of all this carelessness. Yep, this isn't a mad fever dream. Devdan is an actual character who actually exists. While I can't speak much to how he comes off in the Japanese script, in English, Devdan is only just barely a step removed from a minstrel show caricature. He speaks entirely in the third person, has unexplained affinities for flowers and children that both land him in trouble and get him recruited into Ike's army, and he spends 2 of his supports dispensing advice, and the third one literally putting on a street show. Then he shows up again in Radiant Dawn under a slightly different name, claiming to be a completely different person. This never comes up again or leads to anything else. Just why? If you were to ask me which characters will never, ever show up in Heroes, Devdan's gotta be near the top of that list. If these games get remakes, I wouldn't be surprised if Devdan got cut from the roster. No one would miss him, even from a gameplay perspective, since he's a mediocre filler unit in both games. I'm not going to pretend that modern Fire Emblem consistently handles dark-skinned characters well either, but it's leagues ahead of whatever this was supposed to be. And worth reiterating here, Devdan appears in a pair of games that superficially claim to explore racism as a major theme. It really doesn't inspire confidence that these tales of the plights of oppressed animal people also happen to feature a real-world racist stereotype, one that exists without any further context or explanation beyond the gimmick character writing Fire Emblem typically employs for its bit parts. This isn't even touching upon how easy it is to read a variety of familiar racist tropes into the presentation of the Laguz, from noble savages deeply connected to nature, to exoticized mysteries isolated from the rest of the world, to fetishized objects of desire available for acquisition. For that matter, the framing of animal people as racialized others is itself fraught with all manner of unfortunate implications. Hell, you don't even need to read into anything to witness Tellius shooting itself in the foot. Take a look at the endgame of Radiant Dawn, where we're told that Laguz who have children with Beork lose their powers, effectively crippling them for life, and that this ties into long-standing stigmas against the branded, those with both Beork and Laguz blood. This isn't just some throwaway bit of world-building either, because this is essential to understanding the motivations of the setting's overarching villain. Interracial relationships, or at least those that produce children, merit divine punishment and lead to offspring that are ostracized by both Beork and Laguz even generations down the line. And the setting's goddesses seem totally unaware that this is going on, and it's not something that the epilogue addresses in any way. Much like Devdan, this is an element of Tellius that I understand why people would be willing to forget. However, it is a part of Radiant Dawn's main plot, and so if we were to take this story element at face value, we'd be forced to conclude that the writers believe that racism is bad, but that interracial relationships are also bad. This is just about on the same level as Genealogy's plot requiring a brother and sister to have kids with each other. Sure, it's an understated element in a finale already overstuffed with exposition dumps, but again, I have to compare it to FE4. It's remarkable how little the script of that game dwells on the whole Arvis and Deirdre thing, at least in comparison to how it's talked up as a defining element of Yggdrasil. Tellius is unfortunately much the same way. It's hard to attribute any deliberate malice to the developers, but there is plenty of IS's typical carelessness on display, and it severely undercuts any attempt at serious messaging these games might have been trying to go for. The most charitable reading I've ever been able to come up with here is that the Laguz really were just expansions of the Manakete from older games, and tossed into the setting for some distinguishing flavor. Laguz losing their powers for one reason or another is loosely analogous to the Manakete of the older games sealing their powers away in Dragonstones. The branded concept, meanwhile, exists to provide dramatic dimensions for specific characters like Soren, and to put a twist on the familiar idea of humans with magical dragon blood, by giving them that blood not via some mythologized ritual, but rather through more, shall we say, conventional methods. You'll note, however, that that explanation offers absolutely nothing by way of addressing real-world racism, or does anything to paper over Radiant Dawn's dim view of interracial relationships beyond the devs just ran with it and didn't think about the implications. There's a pattern there, and it's one I feel that I keep coming back to over and over again whenever I talk about Fire Emblem. As much as I enjoy the Tellius games, and Radiant Dawn in particular for its story and characters and ambitious game design choices, I can't help but also acknowledge that it's a very flawed experience. And not just from the gameplay perspective that everyone who's played FE10 has already discussed to death. Fire Emblem is an odd series that attracts players with promises of a diverse cast, and women with agency, and queer romances, and whatever flattering political angles you want to read into Three Houses. But the reality is far messier all around, and it can be a challenge to reckon with how many of those elements may very well have come to us as accidents, or as oversights by the writers, or compared with some truly bizarre, terrible material used for off-color comedy, or exist alongside heroes which gleefully exploits anything and everything in the franchise for that sweet, sweet gotcha money. Finding ways to take the good with the bad is essential to appreciating any fictional media. And to that end, I wanted to take some time to talk about the various ups and downs of Tellius ahead of Nintendo and IS actually doing anything with them again, as unlikely as that may be anytime in the immediate future. Of course, you could just skip all the cutscenes and supports and focus entirely on the tactical side of these games, but then if you're watching my videos, I suspect that that's not the sort of Fire Emblem player you are, and that these are the kinds of conversations you might enjoy having. So, have at it. If you played the Tellius games, how do you feel about their writing, and what they bring to the table compared to the other Fire Emblem settings? If you've only ever heard about this duology indirectly, and have yet to experience them yourself, did anything in this video catch you off guard? What's everyone's thoughts on Tellius remakes, and how do you want to see them handled? Tell me about it in the comments, and leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more Fire Emblem discussion videos from me in the future. Au revoir!